my role is kind of hit and run. I'm literally going to say something and run. But mainly to congratulate Michelle on a really incredibly wonderful book, which is anybody that knows you is absolutely not surprised by this. And it's very you, this book, in so many different ways, and that's a compliment. It's great. But I know you also worked with a lot of people who helped craft the book, and I'm sure you're going to talk about them and so on, and in very sophisticated ways. And it's one of these great events where the speakers become the audience, like there's an audience-sized group of speakers, so it's just super good. The only thing I was thinking about was just to say something obvious. I mean, we had these conferences on the big materials like concrete, steel, and glass. And if we were interesting, which we're not, maybe the first conference could have been on ink, and it would have been a really interesting sort of challenge to consider ink as a building material and what would be not with us if ink wasn't with us, both as a discipline and as a world. As a world, if you remove the ink, actually a huge amount disappears, but perhaps also concepts of world disappear, things that were written in ink, or the other sense that that ink, in as much as it allowed communication of a certain kind, allowed a world of a certain kind to be thought of. So I don't mean in the sort of more simplistic Marshall McLuhan sense, although nothing could be more fun. It's possible that only certain kinds of worlds are imaginable through ink. So in that case, in as much as architects build for the world, that means not that it would be more than a building material, it would be the possibility of building and so on. Then I think in just a sort of prosaic sense, as a technology, some of us were trained as architects in ink and around ink, and ink itself was very much part of what, the weirdness of it was very much part of the weirdness of our species as architects. And students now probably imagine that they're not in ink, but in something else. But they are very much in ink. And again, in the McLuhan sense that each technology is only able to show us the technology before it, because the world that it opens up is far too traumatic. It could be, ink could be interestingly considered in that kind of way. Like, so ink as very, very old in the sense of China, but also presumably not the first technology precisely, but also a technology that made available the technologies before it of communication and so on. In this sense, ink would sound to be much more of a building material than concrete, steel, and glass. Or, to say it another way around, what you're doing in concrete, steel, and glass would only have any significance relative to ink, and even at the sort of stupid level of who's writing about your work, right? And if people are not writing about it, it didn't happen. And still, I think we are not at a point in time in which you can write outside of ink. I still think dominant understanding of writing is in that world. So your book, not only so beautiful, so somehow urgently relevant, it seems. And again, I just think, it was a great project also in terms of the bridge that you built between China and New York, and how courageous of you to go to China to talk about ink, and how super charming of China to welcome this conversation, to welcome the idiots, not you, but the rest of us, to reflect upon ink in the home of ink, literally in the home of ink. And there was unbelievable kindness shown to these idiot thoughts of these people from New York. And then it was great to wind it back to New York and then reverse the hospitality and then back again. So I see the book as part of this cycle. So it's a very nice thing. But this is literally hit and run. Congratulations to you.
Well, my sincere thanks to Mark for his incomparable support. The book simply would not exist without him. I'd also briefly like to make a few thanks to Craig Buckley, who's unfortunately unable to join us tonight, for our conversations in the formative phase of conceptualizing the book, to Jordan Carver and Kate DeWitt, without whom ink would not have materialized so beautifully, To our translators for their subtle translations, and to our copy editor, Ellen Tarlin, for her close readings, without whom ink would not have been as easy to read, and mainly to our contributors to the book for their generosity and brilliance, which has just been unparalleled in my experience. I'd also like to thank Gavin Browning, who's been on this project since it was an inkling, and is really the one who's made Ink such a provocative and creative live event this evening. And to the GSAPP Studio X New York, Studio X Beijing, and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, who really supported the project in its nascent phase. My work on Ink has been fostered by these diverse contexts for research for nearly a decade, or at least since 2006. Okay, so beginning within the architectural studio, a hidden alphabet game of ink objects was constructed as a means to reflect quite simply on ink. Composed from various material forms of ink that I found in my studio, I constructed an alphabet of 26 images and sent these images as an invitation to 26 plus architects, artists, historians, theorists, scholars, inventors, and poets to write a brief entry on a discrete ink object. Within each of these images, a letter of the alphabet may be perceived. That letter is materialized literally by ink materials beginning with that letter, yet all is made plainly of mere ink. So to draw the form of a letter from the image, a mixture of the ink materials contained within the frame must be made by the conceptual act of reading. Like ink blots, which ask the subject to draw meaning from material, this alphabet of ink does not function to illustrate the text, or really even the letters themselves, but rather to act as a stimulus, one which operates between concepts, connotations, and the ineffable qualities of ink as a medium, and provoking thereby the responses of the contributing authors and subsequent associations by the reader. Ink is structured as an abecedary, which is an easily recognizable form, ABC book, if in a familiar term, also not easy to say, which may act as both a primer and a poetic form. As a practice book, the Abecedary is uniquely suited to an exploration of ink in architecture. And there are precedents ranging from the simple ABCs of a subject's instruction, its first principles, essentials, or rudiments, to its highly sophisticated use by artists Apollinaire, Baldassare, Cage, Hockney, Johns, Michaud, Ruscha, to architects like Marinetti and Moholy-Nagy, art critics Barbara Rose and Ellen Lupton, and philosophers Bertrand Russell and Gilles Deleuze, just to name a few. As a structure, it's particularly fitting to the contributing author's broad range of voices. The Abecedary foregrounds the material aspects of language, that mysterious area in poetry between a word's form, sensory perceptions, and their interaction with underlying meanings. Yet the Abecedary works conceptually as well as a mnemonic device, or to cognitively encourage analysis and promote abstraction. Provocatively, this room full of ink, as material, representational, and even spatially constructive of its architecture, may imply the extent to which any architecture can be considered to have an ink component, and by which ink can be considered as an indelible part of architectural space. The depth and resonance produced by the subtle coincidences across the contributors' diverse entries has frankly astonished me. As a form of a collective experiment in pareidolia, that's sort of reading Madonnas in toast, the collection of responses constructs what I find to be a phenomenal open history of ink, one which is more provocative than conclusive. And like ink itself, I hope ink may be a medium to help manifest thought in future.
Hello. Yeah. I'm Jordan Carver, and I just say one word from GSAPP Books. And we're really, really excited and humbled to be launching this book. And I have to say that it was by far the easiest book I've ever done, which is to say that Michelle did a really exceptional job of curating such a great cast of characters and in managing everything, and all the traditional roles that our office would have played in editing and in kind of doing rights management and all the nitty-gritty stuff, Michelle handled in an almost superhuman way. And if you know Michelle, that superhuman quality is really amazing. So I can only really stand here as a fan of hers and a fan of the project, and to say congratulations and to kind of lamely turn it over to Kate, who is the graphic designer, and if you can see, produced a very, very beautiful book, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. So, Kate DeWitt.
Hi. Yeah, I would say a similar thing, which is that I think this is one of the most collaborative design projects I've worked on, and I think that it really is the product of the conversations between Michelle and Jordan and myself, and really came very much out of Michelle's creative vision for the book and the content that was brought to the book in the first place. And just to, give a little bit of explanation to some of the thinking that went behind it. And I was really intrigued by Michelle's concept about ink and line and brushstroke and structure in architecture all being really intimately tied together. And so from the beginning, we talked about this book as being one in which we wanted to also explore the structure of the book itself. And so for that reason, we designed the book to take advantage of the signature structure of the book, so that the images that you see appearing throughout do that, because if you were to take this book entirely apart and lay the pages together, those images would reconstruct themselves. And you can see that to some degree on the poster for this event, which is actually constructed from the first signature of the book. So in that place, you can see the images come together as they would be if you were to take it apart and lay it together. And for the same reason, we left the spine of the book exposed, because it really is just a book about structure. And so that is my word on the design of the book. And thank you, Michelle and Jordan, for letting me be a part of this really fun, exciting project.
This is Michelle Lowe. She's generously stepped in to read in place of Sarah McNaughton, our translator.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle also orders many wonderful things on ink.
Yes, I feel obliged to read for Sarah, because Sarah is actually assisting me on curating the exhibition, and post Qingfeng and later on Wei Jia are in the exhibition. So, okay, I'm going to start in the third paragraph, right? Western civilization has rapidly evolved over several thousand years. Yet, one tool for recording it, the brush, still retains its most original characteristics and functions. It is small and exquisite, and expresses the feelings of the literati. The religious essence and the characteristics of civilization reveals the artistic concept of painting. Here, I have changed the brush's shape, for example, to a map or something else. This completes the support of my ideas, imagery, and media. The function, after finishing a piece, it has already become a part of the piece itself. It takes on the weight of ideas, language, and media, while it also embodies the thoughts and expression. Occasionally, through expression, it transforms into a behavior prop or the symbol of a form of a language.
I forgot to mention we're going to hold the applause to the end. We have a small gift from the MoMA collection for our contributors, so they can sign the books. So please. Thanks.
C. C is for carbon black. Carbon is the elemental basis of all life. Black is the absorption of light into mystery. Carbon atoms eagerly bond with one another and with 110 of the 117 other chemical elements of the periodic table, to form the constituents of all naturally occurring matter. Structuring every cell of every living entity, carbon is the biological adhesive of life. The human body is roughly 18% carbon by weight, second only to oxygen in building the mass of our physical being. Remove the water from our bodies and brains, and what remains is almost entirely carbon. Carbon is the living origin of fossil fuel, formed by ancient corpses, decomposed, layered, and compressed over time. Once living carbon resides patiently in long-dead fossilized plants and animals, slowly intensifying their carbonness as they transmute into coal, oil, or natural gas. The tenacity of carbon bonds is broken through combustion or digestion, generating energy from both prehistoric organisms and living cells. Once liberated, carbon atoms are intensely attracted to oxygen, so intensely that their preferred state is to unite with two oxygen atoms, forming CO2 and contributing to the precarious imbalance in our carbon-rich environment. Structurally, carbon atoms seek to bond with up to 4 elements concurrently and exist in 3 distinct forms. Under immense physical pressure, within a viscous layer of the earth, carbon forms transparent, symmetrical covalent bonds, creating structurally rigid tetrahedral networks, also known as diamonds. A second, more quotidian form of carbon occurs in the soft, dark, and lustrous opaque crystalline sheets of graphite. Though anatomically constituted of identical carbon elements, the physical appearance of diamonds and the smudging, smearing traces of graphite are near opposites. And then there is amorphous carbon. Different from its more pure and stable crystalline cousins, amorphous carbon is partially free, intractable, and reactive. This third form of carbon, obtained from the smoky flames of burning bones or other organic materials, is unsettled and impure. Animal skeletons, pulverized, heated, and charred at very high temperature, in the near absence of oxygen, ooze unstructured carbon chemicals. Smooth, dense, and fluid, this residue is the deeply saturated, insoluble black of bone black, the least pure form of carbon. Manifest as carbon bone char, once living structures are transformed into ephemeral yet indelible smoke. The vital intensity of this near zero albedo pigment bringing non-reflective presence to the absence of the life it once was.
C is for construction documents. We became familiar with Dia's collection, consisting mostly of minimal conceptual sculpture and painting of the 1960s and 70s. Early in the process, Yehuda Safran said to us that we had to do nothing with absolute precision. And I took it to heart. Dia was facing the perfect museum dilemma. As Irwin said, a great forum for art runs the risk of ending up with a collection and becoming a museum. Irwin was 71 when we started Dia Beacon. He looked at the project as a phenomenological experience that had to be honed. I was 32. Our most important task was to facilitate, source, find, document every single thought and intuition Irwin had. We did this with the infrequent devotion youngsters give to elders. The spaces at Dia Beacon and the spaces I continue to create are not neutral. They could not receive just any art or activity. Over the years, we have devised a series of recurrent details in tune with the vocabulary of materials. With digitalization and industrial production, building materials have become thinner and are often coated with plastic shields to defend them from wearing. One can shape marble so thinly, a room in Vegas can be done with much less material than a room the same size in ancient Rome. The materials appears to be the same, yet it is not. And the joints and the ink in the construction documents reveal the story. As the raw becomes more rare in our environment and smooth plasticized surfaces appear everywhere, the raw in steel and treated oak or brick walls calls attention to its materiality in space and over time. The raw becomes present, though its refinement in ink, in the drawn lines of details, and in the textual lines of materials specifications. Everything looks good when new and young. The trick is to look novel after a long, useful life. Handcraft things age better than things cut by machine, because craft relates to our bodies in a more profound way. We prefer the gestures of craft, and we use them in dialogue with the gestures in art. We tweak details to work with the flow and rhythm of each particular space, to bathe it in a particular light condition. Repetition, rhythm, and the ready-mades are used to imbue a space with calm presence. We look for a rhythm that is confident yet feels like background. Our aim is to disappear, to make art and building one. We believe our strength as architects is a stealth, active presence, like a good mother, neither neutral, nor passive, nor destructive, which remains discrete, structural, and attuned while sustaining attention with the works and making a space grow over time. To make a space, we opt to use every material tool and stroke in a premeditated, controlled, and cool way. The aim is to disappear. The aim to disappear requires precision above all. The markings need only to be where they need to be. Over time, we get closer to getting it right. The aim is not perfection, but intimacy with space and time.
I must say that I learned to read and write without ink with my mother's finger in the bath, doing the letters in the water so that they disappear and I have to know what it is. Maybe that affected my relationship with ink subsequently. In Chinese art, a traditional aesthetic ideal exists called the three perfections, which refers to the fusion of poetry, painting, and calligraphy. Here, in the former industrial site of Renault in Ile-Sagan, in the west of Paris, we are presented with something comparable, a multimedia project by Marie-Laure Cousin. In this singular work, a moving series of images is interspersed with a text whose calligraphy in ink is subject to constant fluctuation in temperature, so the overall effect is one of extreme elasticity. The images are embedded in a glass facade of the recently completed Heinz office building designed by Vigo. As for the text themselves, they are digitally mediated reproduction of ink originals imbued with specifically thermochromatic qualities. This makes any changes in the external atmosphere immediately visible, fugitive, almost palpable, and at the same time quite conspicuous. Serigraphy makes the image animating the narrative appear to be the daily event of an office, but with a difference. They are affected by the ephemeral quality of the text, which at each moment matches the movement of a corresponding image. In this way, they acquire the character of the surrounding circumstances. We are therefore presented not merely with a narrative or mere illustration of a text, but with something more like the calligraphic inscription in Japanese character. Through this shifting medium, we are told of animals in a garden whose individual songs fuse in a concert that sings of their imminent disappearance. Every word on the glass becomes a voice. In the autumn, wind could have sung the same song. Before and after, around each word, monad-like, the infinite distance enveloped the images and text that only a leap of faith can bridge. Of course, letters and words exist independently of the ink and even of the written words. And yet, who could fail to register the curve of a line? So, and now I read the end. The varieties of script and touches made the facade variable to become not only the artistic record of personal character and individual expression, but also a rich screen of projection and recollection. The experience of viewing this work is much more like the experience of music than anything else. It's faster and slower tempi, stronger and gentler touch, wetter and drier texture, and even louder and softer tones move us to perceive and experience comparable qualities in ourselves. The choreography of a line and form in space is more immediately perceived as we move ourselves. It is this sense of movement, ultimately of dance, that gives life to this montage. Written from the top to bottom, in columns from left to right, move down the column and then return up to the top of the second column, the movement is primarily vertical and horizontal. It's quite different from the horizontal path of our expectation. In addition to the movement forward and backwards as a result of fading and increasing intensity, we are presented with a dynamic simultaneity. This reminds us of an obvious fact often taken for granted, namely that within the range of Western alphabet there are a great variety of letters, forms, and several scripts. The cursive script suggests quicker and less formal writings, which is what we usually practice ourselves for everyday use. To fully cursive script, when we are in a hurry and continue from letter to letter without lifting the pen or pencil from the paper, the latter can be difficult at times to read, even with only 26 letter possibilities. The interaction of movement and pause, energy and stillness gives the completed work its life breath. Thus we begin at the top left, move down the column and to the right as one always does in the West. The choice of cursive script has a much more fluid and rapid feeling. By using the script deliberately against image and format, something new is expressed. It influences the total artistic expression of the work, combined with the gestural action of the writing itself, created with a flexible line that responds to the artist's pulse of breath and movement. The result is an art that is comparable to the calligraphy which has been long admired in East Asia. Each one of us carries a dream of total firm, which she wishes she had realized. Better still, lived. In this facade variable, Marie-Laure Cousin traveled a considerable distance to make this dream a reality. Thank you.
E, edible ink, with caution. The inky cap family, genus Coprinus, is one of the most common varieties of urban mushrooms and can be found growing in thick clumps at the base of trees or scattered across lawns. The family gets its name by its habit of autodigestion. When it reaches maturity, the inky cap destroys itself with its own enzymes, dissolving into a gorgeous, gooey black liquid. Medieval monks made a fine quality writing ink by boiling the deliquesced caps with cloves. My mother makes a delicious soup by cooking quantities of inky caps with butter, a little onion, cream, salt, pepper, and nutmeg. Because the caps start to liquefy within hours of picking, she also uses them for making gravy and in beef stroganoff, where it doesn't matter if they don't hold their shape. Gary Linkoff, author of my trusted field guide to North American mushrooms, rates the edibility of the inky cap family from unknown to choice. One of the family members, Coprinus atramentarian, gets a rating of good with caution. While the mushroom itself is not toxic, if it is eaten within 1 to 2 days of consuming alcohol, it can cause flushes, palpitations, and vomiting. A good host will always inform her guests if it is included in a dish.
Before I read my selection, I want to thank Michelle because For someone who's supposed to know all this sort of stuff, I didn't know what electrophoretic ink was. I mean, I knew what e-ink was, but I didn't know what it was. I thought it was dying tech before I had to write this, before I was asked to write this, and now I'm in love with it and fall asleep to it every day. And I'll read from it. Electrophoretic ink isn't just a display made of carbon black ink and titanium white pigment sandwiched between thin layers of plastic, glass, or paper. It is part of a change in print culture as significant as the one created by the printing press. Reconfigurable on demand, e-ink suggests that in the future we will no longer need pages or books, that we will be able to access any knowledge we want with one page. The current battles regarding copyright will one day end in the liberation of books from ownership, making any networked e-ink page a new Library of Alexandria. But if we turn back to the printing press, we can see that it is not just a means of distributing texts, but also a model for a revolution in culture through the introduction of standardization. Standardized type led to the mass production of objects, while standardized languages accompanied the rise of the nation-state. Standardized imagery allowed architectural designs to lose their ties to local conditions and proliferate. As a digital technology, e-ink promises near-infinite flexibility. Although architects have responded to the potential of the computer with non-standard architectures, with near-infinite variation in form, this is merely a historical footnote. The real promise of e-ink is the infinite flexibility of an object. Barring simple constraints, in the case of e-ink, that of size, the future is not that of a hyper-specific, non-standard world of unique objects. It is a world of generic objects with a capacity to be anything. E-ink promises we will not merely write books and tattoo the spaces around us. It presents a model for reshaping the world into anything. It is the universal spaces of Mies and Artezum, not the specific spaces of Scharoun and Hundertwasser, that will define our futures.
So H is for hatching or haché. The direction in which one composes the arrangement of these lines in order to form shadows is not entirely arbitrary, as many designers and engravers think. Their direction must contribute to the nature or the perspective of the object you want shaded. If the object is round, the hatches must be circular. If smooth, the hatches must be uniform. If uneven, the hatches must contribute to these irregularities. Finally, to achieve the proper effect, whether it be an engraving or a drawing, there is a vast art in varying the lines, the manner by which they repeatedly show the inflection or the general shape of the different objects they cover. If there are multiple hatches, one upon the other, as happens most often, which intersect in a diamond pattern, one must always assign the one that can express the general or particular form of different shaded objects as the dominant one, ensuring that all the other lines are used only as the icing to unify and to increase the effect.
My English is not good. So if I read this in English, nobody could understand. So instead, I will read it in Chinese. It could be the same, but she's going to help me translate. I hope maybe you can get sense of ink when I read. 水墨是新词，指的是从传统绘画中发展过来的中国水墨画。这里要谈的水墨不是材料、媒介，要谈的是其观念。这个观念贯彻于中国所有的传统艺术之中，如书法、诗词、音乐、庭园、戏剧和舞台等，包括禅宗，都是暗示的艺术。在最具代表性的中国山水画中，用笔用墨是表现眼睛看到的和认识到的真实，留白即未画的地方是给予的想象，暗示着天空有湖水、烟云瀑布、山石水幕、受光面等等。在一张白纸上的小船，暗示着周围空白无边的天空有湖水，当你把船拿走或涂掉，暗示立即消失，恢复纸的原本的样子。当我第一次看到 Richard Serra 的作品时，感到如此的惊奇与熟悉。 一个好的欣赏者是同时欣赏形与留白的，这是观看与想象的过程。一个好艺术家是在白纸上用形象改变空白空间和它的意义，他可以用笔下竹子的动态使空白成为阳光，成为雨，成为雪和风，这是画家作画与想象的过程。所以画家与观众是十分明确的互动作用。了解这个互动，你不但可以欣赏传统的水墨，还能欣赏其他中国传统艺术。
Ink is a new word, one that points to the Chinese ink painting that has developed out of traditional Chinese painting. The ink that I am talking about here is neither a material nor a media. What I'm discussing is a concept, and this concept can be found throughout all types of traditional Chinese art, such as calligraphy, poetry, music, gardening, theater, and dance, as these are all subtle forms of art and draw upon Chan Buddhist precepts. In the most representative Chinese landscape paintings, such as a brush or ink express the reality that the eye sees and recognizes. The negative spaces and the places that have not yet been painted are areas for imagination, hinting at the expanse of sky and a lake, clouds and waterfalls, mountains and trees side by side. A small boat drawn on a piece of white paper suggests that the surrounding blank area might be a boundaryless sky or lake. When you take away or cross out the little boat, this suggestion immediately disappears with it, and the original appearance of the paper is restored. The first time I saw Richard Serra's work, I had the same feeling of both surprise and familiarity. A good art appreciator appreciates both what is and what is not pictured. This is a process of looking and imagining. And good artists use the image on white paper to change both the black space and its significance. He can use the dynamics of the brush bamboo to change the black space into sunlight, rain, snow, and wind. This is a painting's working and imagining process. Therefore, there is a clear interaction between the artist and his audience. If you understand this interaction, you can appreciate not only traditional art, but other forms of traditional Chinese art as well.
L is for line. Geometry starts with a point, a single, indivisible entity. Euclid's Elements begins with a definition. A point is that which has no part. From points come lines. Euclid's first postulate states that a straight line can be drawn through any 2 points. Euclid's 2-point description of a line is the basis of computer drawing. Even the most complicated drawing can be coded as a finite list of pairs of endpoints. As lines have infinitely many points, this leap from point to line carries you all the way to the infinite.
The points of a line are barely knowable. True, you can draw a line from 2 points, but most of the points passed over by your pen are ineffable. In the hierarchy of infinities, the number of points on a line is greater than the number of finite descriptions which can be made in any language. So most points of the line have no description at all. The line is saturated by points which are inaccessible to language. If your pen stops at a random place along a line, there is almost certainly no name for its location. The line frames the infinite and unknowable, but in itself is knowable.
Ink. On your beauty diacritical question, check, skid, tick. This day my words hit on the make a. There are as many definitions for the word mark as there are idioms that include it. Its etymology is wandering, complex, and at times mysterious. By most accounts, however, the English word mark comes from the word mork, the Old Norse word for forest. This seems at first a curious origin for the word, unless we consider that the forest, as an objectifiable fact, could only appear as such from its exterior, the point at which one could perceive difference. Having come from the word for forest, that shadowy environment from which humanity did not yet distinguish itself, the word not only suggests the drawn limit of the forest's darkness, but also murkiness itself. Mork in modern Swedish, as mörk in modern English, means dark, somber, dusky, dingy, or obscure. Thus, the word mark itself forms a sort of paradox, denoting both an expansive infinity without perceivable end and the perceivable limit of that expanse. The limit itself became an object, a line denoting a hard and intentional boundary, the frontier of human settlement. It is no coincidence that one of the many definitions for the word mark is frontier, as in march, a borderland ruled over by a marquess or marquis. The rulers of this borderland protected identity and identified enmity. That precarious space, a place that was neither here nor there, was under pressure from either side and could not survive. The marquis's territory would eventually collapse into the no place of the border, an unoccupiable line. If it was through a seemingly progressive process of objectification by which the mark collapsed into the thinnest line, it was by virtue of mastery that the mark shed yet another dimension, eventually coming to describe a point, the infinitesimally small, in fact, dimensionless point of the marksman. Having understood the forest from without, the marksman sought again to demonstrate a mastery over its darkness from within it, piercing through its obscuring veils with precise and lethal vectors. Perhaps it is only by accident that in Japan marks have long been made out of a sort of distillation of the forest, considering the best quality ink to be an admixture of pine soot, preserving perfume, and deerhorn glue, an extraction yielded from the marksman's prey. In the deft hand of the calligrapher, the forest is transformed into a mark refined. The mark is nothing more than, nor nothing less than, the destruction of blankness. One marks to show that one has been there, to claim territory, to find one's way back home, to hold a place in a book, to remember an important passage. It is a drawn utterance, an irreducible unit. It is only 1 degree removed from the hand or body, but existing separate from it. Utterances do not and cannot exist in written language. Wedged between accident and intention, it is a happening transformed by a moment of recognition that remains a record of that very moment.
P is for plotter. The act of drawing is the act of marking ideas conceived within the mind to make them visible. The true purpose is not to relay information to others, but a deeply personal act that makes the drawer's internal thoughts clear to themselves. Unlike dialogue that recedes into a haze of memory, the drawing marks a permanent path that can be traced repeatedly to retrieve the original inquiries. By plotting trajectories, these drawings trace through seemingly disparate notions and generate a cohesive understanding of the noise within the brain. This process makes clear not just conclusions, but also how they came to be. Drawing is not just to see, but to think. Plotting makes this visual thinking possible. Plotting has a parallel definition that is equally important. While still relating to the making of measured drawings, to plot also means to scheme or to strategize. By plotting, we are deliberately conscious of our thoughts towards the achievements of specific outcomes. Recordings or tracings not only serve to tell us how we got to where we are, but also allow us to determine where it is that we want to go. In some cases, a plot may be understood to be sinister. In the broadest sense, the act is strategically self-serving. As a person, the plotter intends to achieve a predetermined goal. However, as a machine, the ink plotter seems to have lost this intentionality. Unlike earlier manual methods, within the digital medium, the image created on the screen is inkless. While these virtual images are comparable to the ones marked with ink, the digital image is also dynamic. Drawing in this sense has become ever more like seeing. Instead of freezing time in a static image, we see movement just as it occurs in reality. However, by continuously reducing these distinctions, we lose our ability to be critical. The disembodied virtual drawing is continuously in flux. Every change made to the virtual image is done with an act of erasure. Movement is really cut and paste, erase, and redraw. The critical evaluation of movement is superseded, leaving only its representation. Ultimately, we must question if these assumptions deserve to remain true. Clearly, the architect remains a plotter, constantly scheming for a better design. To ink a drawing means to affix it permanently, making it rigid in both form and evaluation. The importance of remaining thoughtful and aware in the act of drawing requires that drawings become static. By reincorporating the act of ink plotting into the process of drawing, we can recalibrate not just our methods of making, but also of thinking. This will inevitably remake drawing as forethought.
R is for ruling pen. George Adams the Younger, author and mathematical instrument maker, describes a ruling pen, also known as a drawing pen, in Geometrical and Graphical Essays from 1791. It consists of two blades with steel points fixed to a handle. The blades are so bent that the ends of the steel points meet, and yet have a sufficient cavity for the ink. The blades may be opened more or less by a screw, and being properly set will draw a line of any assigned thickness. The ruling pen, typically used in tandem with a ruler, produces stable and predictable lines of ink, a defining characteristic often contrasted with the quill pen's more flexible but unreliable ink flow. The ruling pen's ability to make consistent lines of even the finest weight made it a valuable tool in the practice of technical drawing. Without the guidance of a well-trained and patient hand, however, the ruling pen and the ruler do not guarantee the production of precisely inked lines. In her book on drawing instruments, Maya Hambly calls attention to the demands the ruling pen places on its user. Before commencing work on an ink drawing, dozens of trial lines have to be drawn before the desired line thickness is achieved, and then the pen has to be repeatedly refilled by means of a dropper or a filler from a pot of waterproof Indian ink. The metal blades of the ruling pen also require, as Hambly tells us, regular cleaning using either a penknife or a razor blade or fine emery paper to remove the dried ink.
S is for sepia. When I see them now, they are not sepia, still losing their edges to the light of a future afternoon. Caught midway between was and must be, for me, they are real, writes novelist Toni Morrison in her magnum opus, Jazz. By imagining the cache of old photographs as not sepia, Morrison's character suspends the decay of the image, colored by deep brown, red undertones with hints of gray. The photographs in Morrison's world mark time by referencing places elsewhere and elsewhen, drawing them into the polyrhythmic cadence of life in Harlem in the 1920s. Sepia's watery, muted appearance and Morrison's prose ignites a circuit of retrospection for her protagonist and readers that propels the past into the current moment and beyond toward the future. Jazz's structure, the unfolding of events through narrative, deploys its namesake genre's characteristic call and response. Jazz music stretches its temporal elasticity, its rhythms accelerating and breaking according to the improvisational play between musicians. In page after page of lyrical passages, Morrison churns her prose until it becomes a brew of multitudinous temporalities. For more than a century and a half, photographic processes have captured time that in today's high-speed digital cameras can be calibrated down to milliseconds. For Walter Benjamin, the photograph destroyed the erratic singularity of the bourgeois object of art. Its technical precision and mass production techniques signified the apotheosis of modernity. The mechanical reproduction of art would be a revolutionary art form, Benjamin pronounced, one that would, quote, emancipate the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. However, as archival photographs from the 19th and 20th century reveals, the pressures of time could not be exiled. Even though they were mass-produced, photographs nonetheless retained their uniqueness as owners imbued them with unique commemorative value.
Smudge. A smudge can't exist without another. Something needs to be smudged. My photograph, my window, my knife blade, my face, my clothing, and of course my drawing can be smudged. I suppose a smudge can be smudged, but would I notice? What's the difference between two smudges? Is a smudge a form? Can a smudge have a figure? If I see a face in the smudge, is it really there? If I deliberately shape a smudge, is it still a smudge? I think I made a mistake when I smudged my drawing, but sometimes I hear about people intentionally smudging. Before Game 7, Phil Jackson smudged the air of a locker room with burning sage to help players into game faces. I've seen artists in galleries making smudge drawings. When I put on makeup, it often ends with a smudge. My children do nothing but smudge. Things of nature can also smudge. My dog can smudge my drawing. The rain can smudge my drawing. A rock can fall on my drawing, but would I call the mark left by the rock a smudge? I think I heard of an artist who made drawings from tree branches marking a page while the branches move in the wind. I suppose the same tree can smudge its drawing after it's done, but would its drawing ever be finished? If it's never finished, when would the smudging begin? Nature can smudge. Is a cloud a smudge? Turner rendered clouds by smudging paint. The sky makes clouds by smudging water. What's the difference? If I see a face in the cloud above me, what's different from seeing a face in the painting of the cloud in front of me? Richter smudged paintings to sense the sublime. If I sense the sublime in the smudges of nature, am I sensing something different from Richter's paintings? Murmurations of starlings look like smudges. At moments, the smudges look like something. When I stare at the coffee grounds after I'm done with my espresso, I see the murmurations of starlings. It's tempting to study tasseography so that I might understand these smudges better. But is there anything to understand? Rorschach was so convinced that these smudges revealed secrets that he formulated a system of smudges. But the secrets were in the looker, not in the smudges, or so the story goes. Leonardo suggested starting with a smudge to compose a battle scene. Careful composition would look too static, too stable. The horse with the twisted neck, kicking away, terrified from the violence, was born in a smudge. Is born the right word? Leonardo saw a horse in the smudge. Rorschach would rather say, the horse was in his head, not in the smudge. The smudge merely opened the door. But it's more interesting to believe the horse was in the smudge, and Leonardo opened the door to what was in the smudge. Is all that I see nothing but random keys to open the infinite doors to my head? Or is all that I see nothing but infinite doors to open? When I smudged my drawing yesterday, did I make a mistake? I tried not to smudge my drawing. I'm not sure why.
S is for stamp, seal. Not the glazed sponge, engraved stamp, or moist agreement.
nor the warm, dull, soft picture forced tight against escaping light, nor the marked approval adhered to the decision press, squeezed together, making an airless secret, nor a permanent bow cut off and glued. Because look, none of this fits on the shelf for occasional use. Officially, this is not just me.
S is for stipple. While line is the privileged terrain of technical pen and drafting ink, the practice of stippling allows for the introduction of qualities in effects typically excluded by precise linearity. Composed of individual dots or specks of ink arrayed in varying patterns of aggregation, density, and scale, stippling shifts the logic of the rapidograph from that of disegno to that of colorito, from terms of outline and profile to those of shade and shadow, mass and volume, texture and contour. Paradoxically, this shift in effects to terms associated with more atmospheric representational modes, such as painting and rendering, is in fact based on the very precision of the medium itself. Modern technical pens possess the ideal qualities for stippling by hand. The precision of the steel nib guarantees a reliable replicability in the size of the dot, as well as a consistent flow of ink that allows for the efficient production of the large fields of inky flecks necessary to build up an image through a density of marks. The simulation of perceptual indeterminacy, the blurring of defined edges into diffuse tones and gradations that characterize the stippled image, is the result of the exactness of the technique. Stippling creates an oscillation between collective effect, the image produced, and individual constituent element, the dot of ink, brought into relation through the technique of the draftsman. Unlike the pixelation of the computer screen or the gap between frames of cinematic film, which operate below the threshold of legibility, the marks of the stippled drawing remain visible even as they cohere into a recognizable totality. In fact, much of the pleasure of stippling derives from the perceivable presence of this very fluctuation, whereby the overall form dissolves under close optical inspection into a field of individual marks of varying density. The simultaneous perception of the represented content and its existence as a gradient field of marks generates a double reading, a coupling of simulation with its exposure as artifice. Stippling generates an illusion continually in the process of revealing itself, producing a perpetual shift between the evidence of the technique and its invisibility.
Technical Pen by Tag Nishimoto. Before you pick it up, you must do some breathing exercise, the kind that you breathe in and out slowly, staring in one direction so that your sight line does not stray off. This is important because without it, your sense of control of the movement of its tip does not equate with the control of your body. After a moment of exercise, you then pick it up and shake it gently with your palm, feeling the movement of the ink inside. It is at this point that the flow of ink and your blood circulation become aligned. Not unlike when you realize that you were bleeding at your fingertip because you poked it with something and you did not realize it happened. Your gaze is fixed on the way the ink streams out from the invisible hole at the tip. There is an undisputable sense of trust in this operation between the flow of ink and your consciousness. When your blood is circulating well in your body and the ink is smoothly streaming out, the sense of union with the touch of invincibleness is undeniable. You feel you can sail to an unknown continent. Now you are navigating on the vast whiteness of the paper. The rich and constant flow of ink instantly becomes the new discovered chart. In no time, you begin to feel that you can make no mistake on this journey. What's more, in this operation, everything gets recorded, so the idea of making a mistake only evokes the sense of security. Like sailing, raising and lowering it to create two simultaneous sensations of time, one of the immediate situation and the other of a longer projected future that is eventually to come. Here and there, you hold your breath as if to make sure that your blood is circulating normally. Not very often, but it happens that a drop of ink spontaneously and mysteriously oozes out from the tip while you are holding it up. It looks and feels like a bloody nose, and yet you know there is nothing wrong with your blood circulation. In this complacent relationship, you can imagine the catastrophe it causes when the flow of ink stops. It is worse than running out of gas on the road because there is no warning from the dashboard. When it happens, your instinct is, like an injured animal in a trap, to lick the tip with your tongue. This may do the magic and you continue, or you realize that it actually ran out of ink and add more into the tube. Or you have no idea and decide that ink may have dried in the tip and needs washing. Washing the tip requires a surgeon's precision, holding it under the running water of the faucet. Staring at the running water seems to crucially determine the continuity of your journey and the wellness of your blood circulation. And when you finally feel the slight movement inside the tip, it is as if you have just rescued a failing heart of someone you love by CPR. At that point, you breathe normally again, with your steady blood circulation and the flow of ink to continue the journey.
T is for thermochromic ink. Ink on the page, smart and reassuring, sets some small piece of the world in its place. Ink orders complexity. Ink transforms a blank surface into a concept to be interpreted by one or many, once or repeatedly, as long as the page exists. But what if ink changed over time? What if ink morphed before our eyes when we touched it or breathed on it? What if ink depended on the perceiver as well as the creator? Might ink then show us not only the information in a careful mark, but also the information in a physical environment at the very moment the ink is being viewed? Might ink as a medium be dynamic and reciprocal? And how might we pause, truly pause, and imagine new possibilities if the ink of our drawings blinked awake from the page and conversed?
Hi, everybody. T is for tortoiseshell. When I was in the 8th grade, my grandfather ran over a tortoise with a lawnmower in our backyard. At first, he thought it was a rock and got frustrated to mask his worry about possibly having to replace the blade. But then he quickly saw the ooze and realized that it was just a tortoise. He kept on mowing. I felt horrible, sick, as I looked at the bits of shell sticking through the grass. The gloss and goo spewing around as though it had been an egg that could walk was now shattered next to my bare feet. Had I known that the tortoise's shell was one of the first methods of moving thoughts silently between people, I would have looked for more code in its fragments. As it was, I stared at them for quite a long time, almost until my grandfather passed by me again. He had a very big yard, and I was just visiting. I don't think for one second that he actually meant to hit the tortoise to kill it. I really don't. And yet, we'd been fighting. I wanted to go live at my aunt's house. I'd been going on about it for weeks, and he wouldn't budge. Later that same night, as I was falling asleep, on the brink of dreaming everything and remembering nothing at all, the tortoise's broken little body appeared in my mind, its beige dots and brown squares, the squares inside squares, and the furrowed shifting in its curved shell that pulled one outlined room into another.
The shattered symmetry hovered as a magnetic haze, collecting my thoughts and organizing them gently. My grandfather, his home, the rooms we were sleeping in, him lying in his bed and me in mine. 2 little dots, all alone, but together, intact and protected. So many other rooms empty, all his children gone, some dead, some far away, my aunt never calling. Just me, him, and these rooms. Life was us living together in these boxes, intact, untouched in spite of so much violence and so much loss. Leaving would shatter even that. I drifted asleep, feeling lighter, freer, as though a curse had been lifted from me, a hate removed and a storm gone. The next morning I woke, feeling solid and complete and whole, certain and knowing. I decided to stay, and even my body understood this. Over bowls of hot oatmeal and small mugs of coffee, I told my grandfather, and he looked at me for the first time in weeks. Expressions can carry a lot that words never do, and from that moment on, everything changed and got better. That was fiction, by the way.
V is for Vermilion, the color of life, the most brilliant, toxic, and fugitive red. Pliny called it the blood of dragons and elephants, the orange-red pigment derived from the precious ore of mercury cinnabar, a compound mined predominantly in China, India, and Spain. Synthetically created through various recipes of sublimation, the first of which was recorded in 8th century China. Mercury and sulfur were heated in a flask until vaporized, leaving a black crystalline mixture, which was then painstakingly ground until it developed into an increasingly brighter and finer red color. Cennino Cellini counseled painters not to waste their time with such experiments, but rather to purchase their cinnabar whole and grind it, he said, as much as you can. If you were to grind it for 20 years, it would be but the better and more perfect. Achieving this brilliant perfection obliges overexposure to mercury. Cinnabar sheds quicksilver tears, which unfortunately leads to tremors, insanity, and death. Perhaps in sympathy, the fugitive red of Vermilion, when exposed to sunlight, eventually also escapes to black.
W is for ink well. What if the material, ink, and the medium, line, merged into one artifact? Van der Velde's design for an inkwell dating from 1898, which we don't see here, but I invite you to envision, embodies such identification. The pliable contours of the ornamented bronze object materialize ink's protean capacity for animation. Combining the storage with the use of ink, Van der Velde's inkwell transposes the container and the contained, the anticipation and the actual act of writing or drawing. It is as if the liquid behavior of ink shapes the inkwell, and in empathetic reflex, the viscous substance spills out of its container to inform the rest of the artifact. This is not only a writing tool, but also a musical instrument, producing reverberations between the several parts of the artifact and its milieu. Indeed, the greatest feat of Van der Velde's inkwell is the ostensible reversal between object and environment. It echoes mimicry formations in the natural world, as when animal or vegetal bodies gradually acquire the morphological properties of their surroundings. The formal pattern of the inkwell emulates the movement of ink spread, not over a solid material plane like paper, but inside a liquid substance, such as water, similar to the emanations of ink from a squid in the ocean. This is a subtle ontological reversal performed by Van de Velde's inkwell, which rehearses ink's resolute extensibility from writing to drawing and to architecture. Drawing from the morphological transgressions of the previous fin de siècle, we now live in a world of animate communication in which distinctions between subjects and objects are no longer solid, a universe of infinite communication in which the coded information of ink retraces the evolution of our own animate being and the primordial desire for extension within a slowly ossifying milieu.
X is for X. X marks the spot. A weary traveler has arrived. He or she has successfully navigated untold obstacles along the dotted lines of a purloined pirate map. Buried there are treasures too dear to name. By marking the spot on parchment, rock, or earth, X propels a journey across physical and narrative space. X is anything to everyone. Moonshine, pornography, treasure, Christ, poison. By marking spots, it allows meaning to go unmarked. X is precious. Its value is measured in the length and sweat it took to get there. The harder we try to reach it, the more valuable it must be. In Stanley Kramer's 1963 film, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, Spencer Tracy, Jonathan Winters, Milton Berle, Ethel Merman, Don Knotts, the Three Stooges, and countless others crisscross California in search of a fortune buried beneath the big W, an X so outsized that it morphs into another letter form. X is a variable. For Valerie Solanas, X found meaning next to Y. In the Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men, she writes that the male is a biological accident. The Y male gene is an incomplete X female gene. It has an incomplete set of chromosomes. X is destination, discovery, denouement. It marks the spot, but not the end.
I is for inky. Inky might refer to the seeping, leaking, and staining by certain gaseous or liquidous substances in an architectural context, and the mechanical systems that contain them to prevent possible contamination. In another architectural context, inky architecture generates ink, as buildings and architecture make news. Recognition relies on having inky fingers, on marking a trail with indelible impressions. Digital media have opened up new avenues for generating ink online, from sites that feature project catalogs to theoretical musings. Despite the shrinking of print media, architecture can eject liquid traces. This represents a shift in control of the conditions for generating ink from specialized and academic publications. Inky architecture is anarchistic. It lacks centralized control of posts or content. Online publishers are numerous and globally situated. Although inky architecture has the potential to open up architectural criticism, at present, the dominant criticism online is the equivalent of alike. The conditions for inky architecture require a saturation of the media with a product. The architectural product may be either built or unbuilt. While thirst for the novel conceit may be epitomized in the unbuilt project, unbuilt work has a fixed number of images that are controlled by the producer and/or their publisher agent with which to create traction. For a built project, the possibilities to become inky are greater and more lasting, and the conditions for documentation are broader. As long as interest remains, architectural tourists may continue to add to the liquidity of a project. Within the reposting of information onto site secondhand, the control of images and information regarding a project may further eclipse the producer and agent. Should architecture continue to spread from specialized to popular browsing by going viral, it could become truly inky. Since I'm last, I want to just thank Michelle as one of the contributors for being part of this great project.
I don't know that there would be questions, but perhaps we could take the questions to the reception, where I invite you to join us for at least 2 tons of edible ink. Thank you.